Hello and welcome back. This is going to be our second lesson of Unit 2, the Gilded Age. This lesson is entitled Industrialization. In your notes, please go to the next available page and remember to write your title at the top of that page. Also, don't forget to include your essential question. What were some of the positive and negative consequences of industrialization? And you can see in the background of this picture here, there's like a factory, right? Because that's what we're talking about when we talk about industry. It's the making of things. Now, the factory system is a bit older than the 19th century. The first industrial revolution really occurred in the 1700s when you had the beginnings of the steam engine. And like in America, we take a lot of the first industrial revolution, new technologies from Britain, but we did have some of our own, such as Eli Whitney's cotton gin and other things. But really, in our class, what we're talking about is the second industrial revolution, which is going to take place beginning kind of in the mid 1800s and going through this Gilded Age time period, which remember is after the Civil War in like the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. And it's defined by several things that you need to be aware of. So again, industry, we're making things, just think factories, okay? That's why we have all these images of like, these refineries and factories. Really, it's based on a few different industries, the making of a few different things, such as like oil and steel. Those are some of the big ones that are gonna like really make the United States during this time period. It's defined by the movement of people. To make industry work, you need a cheap labor source. And that came primarily from new immigrants to the United States, but also it came from rural places within the country itself. So like people, living on farms, they were starting to be replaced by machinery. And where would they go when they lost their job because they're replaced by mechanization, a machine? They would go to the city where they could probably find a pretty easy job at a factory. Now, they would not be making a lot, and this is a notoriously very difficult, very unsafe, very hard life being a factory worker during this industrial time period. But you do have this big movement from the country or the rural places to the cities. Another word for cities is like an urban place. So that's a movement of people at this time. Now, would that be a push or a pull that brought these people to the cities? It's a pull, right? They're going there for opportunities. The opportunity comes in the form of a job. Now, other things that are going to contribute to this, factors that will contribute to why is this happening in the 1800s. You have the birth of new ways of making things. So you have interchangeable parts. That's going to be something that Eli Whitney kind of had along with the cotton gin. So for instance, when you're making a gun at a factory, you have all these different parts that you assemble. Then you're on the field and something goes wrong with that gun, you just change out one of the parts because all the parts for all the guns are the same. So this part that's made here, it can slip right into that part that you broke. Same thing for like a car. Henry Ford was famous for using interchangeable parts. Henry Ford will also be famous for his use of the assembly line. He did not create, I repeat, Henry Ford did not create the assembly line, but he perfected it. He saw its usage in like the meatpacking plants in Chicago. Remember, we talked about the meatpacking plants with the cattle boom. Texas Longhorns would be driven by cowboys up to the railheads in Kansas, and then those poor cows are shipped off to slaughter in like Chicago. Well, in those same meatpacking plants, Ford witnessed these assembly lines where basically the worker at the factory doesn't go to the product and do this and that. The product comes to the worker on like a conveyor belt. So the conveyor belt is moving along, and like here's the conveyor belt, and the product is moving, and there's factory workers lined up here and here and here, and he's going to add like the chassis, and he's going to screw on all the rivets, and he's going to put on the tires, and he's going to put on the steering wheel and whatnot. And as the vehicle goes down the assembly line, it gets completed by the workers, shortening the length of time required to make that product, that vehicle. So that's how the assembly line is going to dramatically decrease production times, allow factories to produce a whole lot more, and allow prices to drop. We'll talk about that more when we talk more about Henry Ford, but that was done with many products at this time. So you have mass production occurring with this new industrialization during the time period, and it's very exciting because remember previously most people had lived, you know, this kind of very old-fashioned lifestyle where they made most of the things they used at home. They made their own, they made their own butter, they made their own soap, they sewed their own clothing. And here you have now, by the latter part of the 1800s, now all of those things are being made in shops, in factories. Maybe not by machines yet at this point, starting to, but they're being made using mass production techniques. That's a key difference here. So you have the birth of these giant businesses with these captains of industry, men like Carnegie and Rockefeller, who we're going to talk about in just a second. And it's all linked. It's all connected by the railroads. By the year 1900, there are over 200,000 miles of railroads crisscrossing the United States. Remember, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad that linked the east and west coast of the United States was completed. And so the country was connected like never before. And all of these goods and you okay? Are you okay? Okay, my brother. Okay. Um, so all these goods are able to be shipped to all markets all across the country and even internationally. The railroads are a big piece of this industrial puzzle. The term laissez-faire, remember, it is a French word and it means let it be, just like that Beatles song. I will not sing for you guys because I am filming this in the summer and I don't yet know how much I want to torture y'all. So I will not torture you yet with my singing. But let it be is this French laissez-faire term. It's an economic term that means business should be free from government interference. And it's kind of formed the basis of capitalism or the free market. And that is sort of the system of economics that we have in the United States. My brother wants to know if y'all know who the Beatles are. I am sure there is at least one of you in one of my classes that knows who the Beatles are. And if there's not, then I need to retire immediately. Also, Star Wars. There's got to be at least one of you who watches the Star Wars movies and will get my Star Wars references. When that no longer applies is when I know it's time for me to leave education. It's true. It's happening. Okay. So that's laissez-faire. And remember, that was one of Alexis de Tocqueville's 5 values that made America different and unique from countries in Europe. The fact that we had this capitalist system, which goes along with our individualism. The fact that in America, you could potentially be whatever you wanted to be. We didn't have a hereditary aristocracy that people were born into. Like, oh no, I'm a peasant. I'm always going to be a peasant. I can't marry outside my station and be suddenly, you know, be a Cinderella or something. Or I'm a noble, right? And I never have to lift a finger and I'm going to be rich. In America, you can be what you want to be. You just have to work hard enough for it. And so that promotes kind of this industry. But remember, the industrialization that we're talking about in the Gilded Age is built off the backs of all of these very poor laborers. We needed this cheap labor source. So most people are very poor working. And then you had a new growing middle class that's buying all this new, you know, factory made stuff. And then you have this new class of very, very wealthy industrialists, these businessmen who are going to basically be controlling the country at this time. At this time. Nothing's really changed. Anyway. So that's laissez-faire. It means the government, again, is not going to be interfering. That's regulations or rules. You know, when the government says businesses can't do this or they can't do that. A good example of this that we used to have before the "he who shall not be named" term began was like environmental regulations to make sure that businesses weren't polluting rivers and the air unfairly. Because we all need clean air and clean water. Those are the regulations. those have since been laxed. But yeah, under laissez-faire, there's no interference by the government. Now you're hopefully thinking, well, how do we have, rules on businesses today that tell them, that they can't be hurting the environment, or telling them that, this business has to pay its workers a minimum wage? Because a lot of you, you either have a job, or you're soon to be getting your first job if you haven't already. And you know that there is such a thing as a minimum wage, right? That's mandated by the government on businesses. And the reason why that works, even though we have this laissez-faire thing, is that over time, especially because of how bad it was during the Gilded Age, we are going to allow some regulation into our economics. Okay, so we don't have a fully laissez-faire, a fully capitalist system. There is some government regulation in place, and it's a result of the terrible things that were happening during this Gilded Age industrial time period. An entrepreneur is a person who starts and owns their own business, a visionary person who has an inkling of what will be in demand in the future and then makes it a reality. So here is a picture of a famous American entrepreneur. His name is Thomas Edison. Edison had hundreds, if not thousands, of patents. Now, to be fair, he also had an imagination factory. So we talked about how factories are where you make lots of stuff. Well, he employed hundreds of his own like scientists who basically invented all the stuff, and then he got to patent it, basically get the copyrights to those inventions that all of these scientists that were under his factory created. One of those scientists, by the way, was a man named Nikola Tesla, an Eastern European inventor. And there will be a big rivalry at this time over which sort of electricity was going to be used by the country, AC versus DC currents. That was called the current war. But an entrepreneur, they have a vision for the future and they go with it. If you can predict, in the year 2035 or 2040, what's going to be the next big thing, and you can get in on the ground floor of that right now, you could be America's next great entrepreneur. That's what these men in the late 1800s did. Carnegie saw the need for steel to build bridges and the infrastructure, the skyscrapers, the cities, the railroads that we had. It needs to be made out of something stronger than iron, and that was steel, and he had a way to make it. Rockefeller, he got in on the ground floor of the refineries, the filtering of oil, and oil became so important with the trains, but then later also by the turn of the century, automobiles. So that's what made these men who built America, these captains of industry, they were called. So there they are. Andrew Carnegie was an immigrant, came over from Scotland, and he is going to set up a huge steel empire centered at the Homestead Steel Mill in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, Andrew Carnegie was born, like I said, an immigrant, very, very poor, kind of had to support his family. He was working as an intern at a railroad company. Basically, I think by the time, but even before he was 10 years old, he was, a page boy running errands and stuff. So he really did work from the ground up to make his big company, Carnegie Steel. Now, John D. Rockefeller, he was also born very poor in Ohio. His father was famously a con man, out of the picture, so he had to support his mother and his siblings, and it was very devout Christian. And John D. Rockefeller will eventually get on the ground floor of refining, and then will kind of corner the market on oil. J.P. Morgan, he is going to be famous for not being born poor, but being born excessively wealthy and then using his family's vast wealth to invest in all sorts of businesses. So he's kind of what I think of as the money bags of these rich businessmen during this time period of the Gilded Age. Now, we have several terms for these men. Sometimes we call them the men who built America. And when we're doing that, we call them like captains of industry, because they each were leaders in their field. JP Morgan, famous today for like JP Morgan Chase Banks. He was famous for banking, and like I said, for investments. One of the key investments that he made was into Thomas Edison's General Electric company. Morgan will also later take over Carnegie Steel, make US Steel. At one point, JP Morgan is so rich, in fact, that he's going to bail out the United States government. That's the enormous power and influence and money that these men possessed. Again, they're kind of the ones in control during this time period. We won't spend a lot of time talking about Gilded Age presidents because they weren't as powerful as these businessmen. John D. Rockefeller was the captain of the oil industry. He is definitely the oil guy, and his giant monopoly, or the big company that he founded that's going to take over all the other oil companies until it corners the market. That's what a monopoly is, was known as Standard Oil. Eventually, Standard Oil will be broken up into lots of smaller companies at the behest of the Justice Department. But you could still see the remnants of this with like Exxon. The Exxon gas stations, that's the leftovers of like Standard Oil. And then Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel. So remember, he's like the captain of the steel industry. He's the steel guy. Steel, oil, banking. There were many other entrepreneurs during this time period. You had Vanderbilt a little bit earlier with railroads. You had Sears Roebuck kind of starting to get in on the kind of, mass department store type thing. But these are the ones you will need to be aware of for this class during this time period, if no others. And again, they're all relying in their steel mills and in their oil refineries and in all their businesses that they had invested in and bought out on this influx of cheap immigrant labor coming over primarily at this time from Europe. Immigrants were coming from new places in Europe in the late 1800s, we'll talk about, places such as Southern and Eastern Europe. And they will be working in cities very cheaply, getting paid next to nothing, and working in very harsh conditions, fueling this new industrial economy of ours. I mentioned Carnegie had a new way to make steel. So steel is much more durable. It's much tougher material than iron. My favorite book series, The Song of Ice and Fire, which the Game of Thrones TV show that you should not watch because you're not old enough yet, is based off of, has a great quote in it by Stannis Baratheon, where he says that basically iron is brittle. Stannis, he'll break before he bends. That's what iron is. It's very hard. You can make railroads out of it, but it's going to rust very quickly and it's not going to last for very long. It gets eroded. Steel is much more durable, lasts for much longer. But it was very difficult to make before the Bessemer process. In fact, it was so difficult to make that before Carnegie and the English scientist Henry Bessemer team up, the only steel you could find was like in such small quantities, it would be like jewelry or even maybe like forks and knives, very, very small amounts of steel. And then Carnegie finds Henry Bessemer, and the new Bessemer process involved this big furnace. You could superheat the iron ore, melt it down. They would inject it full of like oxygen, oxygenating it. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't really, give you the whole process, but it was a new way to make it much cheaper, much quicker than ever before, so they could mass produce steel basically. And that's what Carnegie steel mills did. They mass produced steel. And suddenly now America is going to be built out of steel. All of our railroads, remember, hundreds of thousands of miles of rails. Cities are starting to go upward during this time period. You're starting to get skyscrapers with the steel, what do you call those? The steel beams at this time. That's through the Bessemer process. Remember, that's going to be done by Andrew Carnegie. He was from Scotland. He also Andrew Carnegie also, I'll show you another picture of it a little bit later, but he kind of looked like Santa Claus. We'll talk more on that later, but remember, he's the Santa Claus looking guy. Now, there is a dark side. There's the dark side to these captains of industry. And when we're referring to the underhanded bad things that they did, we talk about them as robber barons. So Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, all these Gilded Age business leaders, when they're doing bad stuff, we include like they're not paying their workers very much. Okay, working in a factory, getting paid next to nothing. That's bad. These dudes, they'd be called robber barons for treating their workers that way. Their workers worked in bad conditions. They are also cutthroat when it came to their business tactics, you know, cornering the market, buying out everybody else until they're the only one left, they're the only monopoly. These bad things that they did, you know, controlling the government and their workers suffering, they're referred to as robber barons. When we talk about the good things that these businessmen did, we refer to them as the captains of industry, meaning kind of like these are the guys who built America as a modern industrialist leading nation. They were very competitive. They were top of their fields. And they made our country one of the most prosperous in the world, which we hadn't always been. This is when America's starting to rise to the top. Okay, and we will stop our lesson there. I appreciate you guys. So that's the end of part 1. Remember, just pause your notes. Don't do a summary yet. We'll do that into part 2. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you guys later.